la la, indeed. Great to see such a full room. I guess racism and cocktails go really well together. So I hope you enjoy your cocktails. I'll be talking about the development of racial prejudice in children and what all the different socialization agents have to do with that. I won't be speaking about God, and I like blaming the government, but they're also not in this particular presentation. So we'll be talking a little bit more about more immediate influences on children. So I'm going to start with this story that some of you may have seen a few years ago. It's a heartwarming story of two boys who are in the same classroom and who decided that if they both shaved their heads, that the teacher would no longer be able to see the difference between them two. Now, I think we can see the difference between these two boys, right? But they were really convinced that if they'd had their heads shaved the same way, that the teacher would be, who's who? I can't see the difference. That they would look like twins. So they were branded the colorblind boys, who really didn't see color and who had no idea that there was an actual very clear difference between two of them. So this raises the question that I think a lot of us have asked ourselves when we think about this: are children indeed colorblind when it comes to ethnic racial differences, like this particular cartoon seems to suggest is possible? So that's the big question. How do we research this? So there's been a lot of studies, mostly in the United States. There's been one in the Netherlands about babies and whether babies are colorblind or not. And they study this using the idea of habituation. And that's the notion that babies, as adults actually, but babies also in particular, get used to particular stimuli when they're exposed to them. They get bored, basically. So you show them a car, and they're like, oh, a car, that's interesting, and they look. And then another car, okay, it's still interesting. And then car number 3 and number 4. And after about 30 seconds of cars, they start looking away because they get bored. They've seen the cars. If you then introduce a bicycle, they will reconnect with the screen because it's something new, right? And that will tell you that they see the difference between a car and a bicycle. You can apply the exact same principle to skin color and to ethnic racial differences. So what they do in research is this. They show faces of white people, one after another, until the baby starts looking away. Like, yeah, I've seen them. They're people, right? Then they introduce pictures of, for example, Asian people. And the question is, do the children remain looking away? Like, yeah, they're people. I've seen people. Or do they reorient and like, oh, these are different people? And then they do the same thing with black faces, and you can do that with several different ethnic racial groups. Turns out, babies do exactly what you'd expect them to do when it comes to objects or people who are different. They reorient as soon as a different ethnic group comes into the picture. So they see the difference because all of a sudden they're re-interested again, and it's apparently to them not the exact same thing as it was in the earlier series. So in response to the questions, are children colorblind? The answer is no. And these were babies of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months. So even at 3 months, babies reliably detect the difference between major ethnic racial groups. Another thing that happens in exactly the same period, so in the period that babies become better at distinguishing between ethnic groups, they become worse at distinguishing between individuals within ethnic racial groups that they are not usually exposed to. So that's what we call the other race effect. And that is that people from a different ethnic racial group than the one that you are daily, exposed to in your daily life, all look the same. It's an embarrassing feeling when you think like, oh my God, I don't see the difference. And that's because our brains have not been exposed to all the variations and the details that you need to process and recognize individual differences in faces from ethnic racial groups that you simply don't see enough of, right? So it's not only about your own group, because babies don't know what they look like, right? They don't know what they themselves look like. All they know is what everybody else around them looks like. So roughly from the age of 6 months onwards, babies become increasingly worse at distinguishing between faces in unfamiliar groups. Now this is relevant to the idea of prejudice, because you can imagine if a group no longer looks like individuals, but looks like an amorphous group of they're all the same, You can sort of imagine how prejudice, stereotyping is, one of the things that may emerge from the notion that they're all the same. They all look alike, they're all alike. This is a process that, happens really early in development, simply because of a lack of relevant input for our brains to realize what the differences are that we should be looking for. It's also reversible. Spend 1 year in a different country with people who look different, and it's completely reversed, and you will be able to see the differences between different faces in different groups. So this is really a measure of exposure. But this happens, generally speaking, in relatively homogeneous, monocultural environments to babies. The other thing that happens with babies is that they start to prefer faces from the ethnic group that they are usually exposed to. In particular, the ethnic group of their parents, mostly the mother even, if that is indeed the person that takes most care of the baby, as is statistically usually the case. And that preference is simply a preference for the known, for what we know, what we're familiar with, what seems nice, what seems warm, what seems intimate. So there is very early already a slight preference for looking at faces that are familiar and similar to the group that you know, even when you're this young. So, babies aren't colorblind, and they never become colorblind later in development either, because roughly there between, sitting and crawling, babies see the difference between groups. Now that's seeing the difference between groups, but one of the things that we're interested in is, what are their opinions? When do children start forming opinions or ideas or prejudices about different ethnic racial groups? So there's been quite a bit of research in the United States and in the UK, only a little bit in the Netherlands. And I'm showing you some of the Dutch studies that I've done with my team about this, and that's about in-group prejudice and out-group rejection. And these are the two elements of prejudice that are usually measured in scientific studies like these, where we look at the extent to which individuals prefer their own group and prefer to hang out with their own group, prefer to have social interactions with them, and the extent to which they would reject or prefer not to interact with people from other ethnic racial groups. So what we did is have a whole series of pictures. This is a version that we used with unstandardized pictures, just taken from the internet, where you can see 4 white children, 4 black children, and 4 children with what we usually label as a Middle Eastern appearance, but that's a colonial term. But it usually refers to the group that in the Netherlands is seen as the Muslim group. So the Turkish and Moroccan and Syrian minorities. So it's a particular way of appearance that is associated with that group. And we tested that in Dutch pilot studies to make sure that that is the association people have with this group, to really represent some of the major ethnic racial groups that we see represented in our society. So we have these pictures here, and then we ask children, and in this case we ask children 6 to 8 years old, to tell us, pick one of these children. Who would you want to play with? Or who would you not want to play with? Who would you like to sit next to, or who would you not want to sit next to, and who would you invite for your birthday party? So the first 2 questions, children could pick one kid only, and the last question, they could pick as many or as few as they wanted. And therefore we didn't ask who you would not invite to your birthday party, because the people you didn't pick were basically not invited. I'll pick out the question of who do you want to play with. So these are these were the 6 to 10-year-olds, white Dutch children, I should add. And this is the in-group preference here, because about 75% of these children chose white children when they were asked who they wanted to play with. So these are pictures of children they do not know. If you pick randomly, this would not have been the pattern, right? If they had picked randomly, you would have seen about a third in one group, a third in the other group, a third in the other group, right? To add up. But this is a picture that you see a lot in this type of study. So white children reliably choose white children to play with even if they don't know the kids whatsoever. If you ask them who they don't want to play with, the pattern is pretty much reversed. So you see that the Middle Eastern group and the black group are chosen way more often than the white group to not play with. We see the same thing with the other questions. So this is a pretty a pattern that we see across the different questions that we ask. So you can do the same thing again, but with more standardized pictures, because these are very unstandardized, right? So some are smiling more, some are, with a different background and different clothes. So we also use a version with very standardized pictures because of all sorts of reasons I can't show them, because it was a special photo project and I promised not to. I can show them in a presentation, but because this is videotaped and will be put on the internet, I can't show the actual pictures, but they were standardized. So they were all facing the camera, they all had the same t-shirt on, they were all smiling in a very similar way, they were all piloted to make sure that they represent the three groups that we were interested in. And this time around, we asked the same questions, but we also looked not only at white Dutch children, but also at Turkish Dutch children and also at Afro-Dutch children to see what their answers would be like. And now I'm just going to show some results with all the questions collapsed, so the scoring is slightly different. It's no longer percentages, but the pattern will be recognizable. In-group preference, so the white Dutch children choose the white Dutch children more often than they choose the other two groups. Interestingly, the Turkish Dutch children choose the white children and their own in-group almost equally, right? And here in the Afro-Dutch group, there is also in-group preference and slightly less preference of the two out-groups. So this is a pattern we find more often, also in other studies, is that the in-group preference is higher in the majority group than in the minority groups, which sort of makes sense because, the majority group is everywhere. So you can't go around hating them too much because you have to deal with them all day. So this is roughly the pattern. This is what we see here. Then when you look at outgroup rejection, you see the reverse. And you see here that in particular, the black group is chosen most to not play with, not sit next to, not invite to your birthday. And you can see here for white Dutch and Turkish Dutch, they don't really seem to distinguish between those two groups. Interestingly, Afro-Dutch group, no significant effect whatsoever. So these bars are not significantly different from each other. So basically no outgroup rejection in this case. This is a random pattern, basically, right? If you picked at random, this is what it would look like. Again, rather similar to the international literature. More outgroup rejection by the dominant group than by minority groups. You can also look at things differently. We can not only ask them to pick children, but we can also ask them to label children with certain characteristics, right? Which one of these children is smart or nice or friendly, which one is stupid or annoying or dumb or mean. So you can have positive words and negative words. And for this we selected half of the children, again in the standardized setting. So there was one boy and one girl of each of the three groups to pick from. And for each word they could give them to two children. Now what we added, because this is in research an important I think addition to this type of test, this is a little bit like the doll test that you might have seen before, right? A black doll, a white doll, and you ask them to say who is smart, who is nice, etc. And one of the criticisms of that is that children don't actually like to give the negative labels to anybody. They get really uncomfortable, but you make them do that in a test like that. But in tests in my field of research, we usually add a bin, and they can also throw a characteristic in the bin. So then they don't have to apply it to any of the children or any of the dolls or any of the pictures. So this is what we did, is say in the same group of white Dutch, Turkish Dutch and Afro-Dutch children, 6 to 10 years old. And this was the positive attributions. And you can see that the white Dutch children got the most positive attributions in all three groups, which is sort of similar to some of the doll tests you might have seen in some documentaries here and there. That's actually the biggest pattern in this specific group, that the white group gets most positive attributions. This has to do probably with what children see around them in terms of, who is valued, who is in the spotlight, who is represented. But we'll talk a bit about that later as well. These are the negative attributions. And you see that the white Dutch photos get the fewest negative attributions. The numbers are lower than in the other one. If I just go up one more, and you'll see that these numbers are higher, right? So here they throw the characteristics in the bin more often, because these are the negative ones, and children don't like to be negative about others. So they are lower, but you can see here again a clear pattern of at least the white Dutch children being getting fewer negative attributions than in particular the black group, but also the Middle Eastern group. So children are not only not colorblind, children show prejudice, and these were 6 to 10-year-olds. That's because it's easier to do tasks, from 6 years on, but there's also studies on 4 and 5-year-olds, not in the Netherlands, but elsewhere, that show rather similar results. So somewhere around, preschool age, school age, this is a pattern that you see everywhere. A clear in-group preference and an out-group rejection. All right, well, that's nice, isn't it? This early. starts with babies, and then, toddlers, and where did innocence go? Well, this has something to do with it being a pretty human characteristic, right? Humans have evolved to be all sorts of things, and one of them is to be prejudiced, basically. And that's got to do with 3 main characteristics of humans, and the first being that we find it super important to belong to a community, right? Which is good for our survival. By ourselves we would be completely useless back in the days when we were living in very uncertain conditions. You need a group. You need to hunt together, you need to protect each other, you need to in some way form a community so you can sustain each other and protect each other. So that's nice, it always sounds a nice community, but the whole point about a community is it can only exist by the grace of some people not belonging to it, right? So belonging in a community is great, but it also means that other people do not. So the tendency to think in groups is there, and it's supposed to be a pretty evolutionary-driven characteristic of humans. The other is the human need to categorize, to have predictability. So to understand our world, we categorize constantly, right? You know that the glass that you just got is to drink from, even if it's in a shape that you've never seen before, right? Because you recognize it. It's got certain characteristics that make you think, oh, this is a glass, I'll drink from it, right? For all sorts of... So you could have many different types of glasses, and we would have gone click, 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 that's a glass, that's fine. If we didn't do that, we'd have to think about every single object and situation that we encountered all over again. It would be impossible to get anything done, right? So it's a really handy skill. Same with people. The person walking down the train, in a certain type of outfit, is the person that wants to see your ticket, right? If they're male or female, tall or small, there's all sorts of characteristics that could vary. You'd never seen them before, but you recognize the category of the train conductor. So all very handy. The problem is we also do it based on characteristics such as ethnicity and race, when we don't need that information at that particular moment. And it turns out that ethnic racial characteristics as well as gender are processed within milliseconds of meeting somebody, like almost immediately. So think about it, right? You never meet somebody, and then afterwards you went home and said, yeah, I met this person. Can't remember whether it was a woman or a man. Never happens. You always remember, right? Unless it was a very gender ambiguous person, which happens sometimes, but then you'll be talking about that. Same with clear ethnic groups, right? You always remember. You remember whether they were white or brown or black or Asian or something like that. You remember these things. So they're encoded super quickly, super automatically, and you always remember them. So that's part of our categorization tendency that is adaptive but can also cause issues. The third evolutionary characteristics of humans is risk avoidance. And that's got to do with uncertain times and who can we trust, and maybe people are dangerous. There are certain researchers that write about the human brain being set like a smoke alarm. Even the littlest bit of smoke will set it off. And there's a lot of research that anything that is different or unexpected will make us feel slightly more uncomfortable, slightly more, less well at ease. And something like a skin color or ethnic racial characteristics that we are unfamiliar with does exactly that. Makes us slightly, one step back, not sure about this, it could be dangerous, don't know what their intentions are. Even without us meaning to, our automatic response to the unfamiliar is one of risk avoidance. So this doesn't help. Now what? If this is it, we're evolutionarily programmed to be prejudiced, to be racist, well, that's, where do we go from here, right? Well, the thing is, we're also evolutionarily programmed to procreate as much as possible. You're all still sitting here with your clothes on. You're doing pretty well. So there's a lot of things that people can do to not be a slave to their evolutionary tendencies, right? We do it all the time. We think about things, we educate ourselves about things, and we try to, think of consequences and have all sorts of ways to inhibit some of our most automatic behavioral patterns. The same is true of things like prejudice, and that has to do with the environment that we grow up in. And it's not entirely to be avoided. I think people who say, I want to raise my children without prejudice, I always tell them it's impossible. It's not possible. It's the second sentence of my book. It's impossible. We are prejudiced peoples, right? And that's all right. The whole point is, do you know that you are? Do you know to recognize when you're being it, right? And can you reduce the effect of inbuilt prejudices on your actual behavior? Those are some of the things that that can be learned also from a young age, and that is where socialization comes in. And so this refers to any relevant adult in children's lives, actually peers as well, of course, but I'm talking a little bit more about the intergenerational transmission of prejudices. So parents, teachers, the books that children read, the films and the series that they watch, so anything that they get exposed to that will tell them something about who's who, who's valuable, who's not, what is normal, who belongs and who does not. So what do children learn about race and ethnicity? What do they hear? What are they told when they speak of race? That's interesting. Do adults speak about race at all? So I took this idea from an American research group who used the game Who Is It, or Guess Who, as a way to see whether people talk about race. So they made a version that isn't the old-fashioned version like you see here, but is a version, and this is another one that we made, with people with different skin colors. So the 50-50 questions are always the ones that will make you win, right? So this is half women, half men. It's half children, half adults, and half black people and half white people. And then and they have names, and you can ask all sorts of things. And then the question is, if adults play this game, what do they ask? What will be their questions? This is what their questions were. So all of them ask about gender. It's almost always the first question. Is it a man or is it a woman? Skin color, only slightly over half, but it is a 50-50 question and a pretty clear one, most of the time. And the age one was asked, close to 80% of the time. So skin color clearly less often than the other 50-50 questions. This was also found in the United States. This was in the Netherlands. In the United States, they found the same thing, and they found this from about age 12 upwards. So I've only done this with adults, but they've done it with kids as well. And the 12-year-olds sort of stop asking the race question, and it means that the 10-year-olds beat the 12-year-olds. Because the 12-year-olds are not making use of one of the key 50-50 questions, and they end up losing the game to younger kids who do still ask the race question. So there's some socialization going on here where kids learn to not say the word, to not talk about it, right? To not mention it. And then when they do ask, so say these are the only 2 kids left. This has literally happened in our study as well. And they have to come up with a final question. And it goes like this. Yeah. How do I say this? Does he? Is his left ear visible? Does he have a white collar on his shirt? Yeah, this literally happens. So there's lots of discomfort, and they end up coming up with something oftentimes that is like you had to look for it. So this is not something people talk about. These were just 150 adults that we, asked for this particular study. But we did the same thing in the parents of the children of the studies I showed earlier. So the parents of the 6 to 10-year-olds that we were researching earlier, to see if parents would mention this or not. And they would play the game with their child. So it was also a direct message to the child, right? If you're playing it with your child, you are showing the child, modeling to the child, are we mentioning this, yes or no? And we know the children aren't colorblind, right? So what we found here is in the 3 different groups, we had 2 versions of the game. So with black versus white people, and here with black versus Middle Eastern faces. And you see that it was mostly the white Dutch parents who never asked a question, whereas the black parents were more likely to ask the question. So this is color evasion, I should be clear about, right? So this is the extent to which they did not ask the questions. So you can see that over 30% of the white Dutch parents did not ask the question in this particular game. And only 10% of the black parents did not ask the question at all once in the game, right? So sort of a similar pattern here. It's a clear characteristic, but people don't like to talk about it. Now this is also quite consistent with broader research in this area about talking about this in families, right? Where we see that when it comes to ethnic minority parents, they talk about this in with their kids. They talk about prejudice, about their ethnic and cultural background. They talk about discrimination experiences. They talk about, societal issues to do with these types of differences. And white parents do not. What we see a little bit is that it turns out to often be well-intended. Well, it's a bit about 2 things. One is discomfort that we saw in the Who Is It game, right? What words do I use? What do I say? I might say the wrong thing, and I'm not even sure about it myself, so what am I going to tell my kids? And then there's the well-intentioned, if I don't talk about it, they won't see it, because children are colorblind. And if I point it out, if I talk about it, then they're going to see it, and then all of a sudden, they're going to think it's important. And it shouldn't be important, so if I don't mention it, then my children will learn that it is not important. Now, the whole problem is that, unfortunately, in our society, race is important. It makes a difference. There is a host of research out there that shows that you will be treated differently in the housing market, in the job market, by the police, by the Belastingdienst, if you have certain ethnic racial characteristics. So, unless we live in a post-racial society, pretending like there's no differences is not a proper representation of reality. Which means that if you don't talk about the difference, you also can't talk about racism. How do you teach your children that there is such a thing as racism if you're pretending like the whole color thing isn't even there? So sometimes even the colorblind approach, even though generally well-intended, is also called the new racism in some of the literature that I'm reading, because it is also, to a certain extent, a privilege. Haha. I asked for a sweet. This is very sweet. I wanted a pina colada, but they don't have them. Right. So it's a privilege to have a cocktail, but it's a privilege to not have to talk or think about race, to suggest that it isn't there. Because it is there for people of color, right? They know that it's there. They experience it every day. So that is one of the reasons why it's sometimes called the new racism, even though it's generally intended to be very much not racist. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Sorry, too much. We also did a few other things to figure out to what extent parents would show color evasion or not, and then also how that related to the children's prejudice scores, right? Because we also measured that. So we had a special picture book made with pictures of children from clearly different backgrounds, just by themselves, but also in sort of contextualized pictures. And there was no text, and we basically asked the parents to just, go through the book with their children and talk about the pictures. That was it. That's all we asked. And we videotaped that. And then we, made transcriptions of what was said, and we really had a look to see whether any of this was mentioned. Did they talk about the clear ethnic racial differences between the characters in this book? Now, it's interesting, a lot of especially with young children, color is mentioned a lot, right? Look at the color of that ball or of the t-shirt. Color is like a big topic when it comes to young children. But what we see here is that many parents do not mention color at all. That is skin color. They mention all the other aspects, but not necessarily skin color. So they can go through the book and say they see boys and girls, and they can see all sorts of background characteristics. And at the moment, we've only analyzed the videos by the white Dutch mothers. These were only the mothers. We looked at the fathers as well, but we haven't analyzed those either yet. But with the mothers, the white Dutch mothers, we clearly saw a pattern of avoiding mention of something that was quite clearly visible in the pictures. The most important question for us was, okay, so if we do it like this, so this is not a game, this is really an extended book, and lots of opportunities to talk about it, because in the game it's only one question, but here there's page after page, because in total I think it had 14 or 12 pages, so enough opportunity to talk about it. What does that do? What's the association with children's prejudice? So we looked at mothers who generally showed a color evasive pattern, so not mentioning it in the picture book. And we also looked at some of the questionnaires that they had filled in about whether or not they talk about it. And then we had mothers who were more what we call color conscious, so who did mention it and who did report having these types of conversations with their children. And what we basically saw is that the children showed different patterns. So the mothers who showed more color evasion had more negative, more prejudiced attitudes towards their outgroups, towards the non-white children in the tasks that that I showed earlier. Whereas the children of the mothers who were more color conscious clearly showed more positive and less prejudiced attitudes towards the ethnic racial outgroups. So the good intention of not talking about it actually has the reverse effect. And this has been found also in the United States. Similar effects have also been found in organizations. So organizations that have as a policy that, everybody's the same, everybody's equal, everybody's the same. We don't talk about ethnic racial differences in our organization. People from ethnic racial minorities are actually less happy in those types of organizations than in the ones where it is talked about. Inter-ethnic relations are also better in organizations and in study programs where it is talked about than in the ones where it is not talked about. So there's various settings, not just a family, where it turns out that talking about it and acknowledging difference and acknowledging the processes associated with that actually works against prejudice rather than to actually make prejudice. So what we learned from this is really that we should not be colorblind, but that we should be what this person calls color brave. So to really, it can be uncomfortable, it can be difficult, it might not be something that we naturally do. In the Netherlands in particular, in white families, nobody's been taught how to talk about this, right? Even a generation ago, I think the color evasion may have been even bigger than it is now. So we haven't been taught how to do this. But it turns out that it is actually better to at least give that a go, to teach the children about this. Now, it's not just about talking about difference, talking and acknowledging race and racism. There's another thing that parents, adults can do for children to reduce prejudice, and that is intergroup contact. This is a very strong theory that has been proven by hundreds of studies since it was first coined in the 1950s. And this is really about the idea that the more contact there is between different groups, the less prejudice there is between groups. This does not just go for ethnic racial groups, it also goes for, rivaling football clubs, it goes for all sorts of groups who would normally think, they don't belong to me, this is a different group. So in-group and out-group differences. Contact between them reduces prejudice. Now, not just any old contact, right? You can't just throw them all together in a room and hope that they will all be fine and then, all of a sudden magically they are unprejudiced. There are some, qualifications there that we need to look at, because research also shows that, consistent with the original theory, there are some things that we need to look at. So if we are putting people together in the hopes of reducing prejudice between groups, then it is very important that these groups are in that situation on an equal basis. And this is often where it already goes wrong, depending on the situation, right? So some sort of equal basis needs to be there in terms of the roles and the positions that they have in that group. There needs to be some common goals, ideally, some cooperation, and also importantly, some institutional support. So not just the people themselves having the right intentions, but there also being an organization around it that says, this is important, we support this, we think, we want to really look at this and take it seriously. So intergroup contact, great, and ideally with these types of characteristics in place, lots and lots and lots of research shows exactly that. It will reduce prejudice between groups. Because what it does is it humanizes the other. Instead of becoming a group, they're people. Turns out they're people. I like this one, not that one. That one's friendly, that one is a bit shy, and this one is a bit such and so. And that's the entire point. That it ceases to be a group, but they become individuals with characteristics, some of which you like, some of which you don't like. That is exactly what humans are like. But if you haven't experienced that, they remain this amorphous group that you can have a prejudice or stereotype about. So the humanizing and the bringing closer is exactly what happens in this type of contact. Now, unfortunately, society does not really help us along here. This is a map of Amsterdam, and this is a measure of ethnic segregation in Amsterdam. You can also do this in The Hague or Rotterdam, or, I think The Hague is the most segregated city in the Netherlands. But the dark blue is basically mostly white people. You could have guessed that. That's the center. The grachtengordel. And then the red is where most people live with what was then still called the non-Western ethnic minorities in the city. So slightly more balanced would be green or yellow or orange. Well, there's some yellow around some of the red spots, but you can see here that this is a pretty segregated picture. This is also the case in primary schools. In primary schools, they calculated that if you want a more even proper distribution of ethnic groups across schools, then you would have to move half of the children in Amsterdam to a different school. The same statistic applies to The Hague and Rotterdam and Utrecht, right? So we're not doing very well. The whole intergroup contact is not easy when our cities look like this. Let alone the parts of the Netherlands where, things are almost entirely blue. Luckily, there were some researchers who thought, okay, actual contact, not going to happen. Or at least unlikely. Let's look at other types of contact. And they started researching what is called imagined and extended contact. So what if you don't have direct, immediate contact with actual people, but you think about contact, or you imagine it, or in some way get exposed to the idea of contact, which can be done, for example, through children's books, or films, or series, or television, anything like that. So that's really about the idea that you see some form of diversity, people you don't encounter in real life, but they exist. And we know how for children, fictional characters can be huge in their experience, right? And in how important they find them. So exposing children to diversity in other ways than in direct human contact has been called either imagined or extended contact. And it turns out it's effective. We would like our societies to be more mixed, obviously, but this also has a positive effect on children's intergroup prejudice. So if you are in a completely white village and have very few opportunities to expose your children to other groups, then this would be the very least you could do to at least introduce the idea that there are people out there that, look different to themselves. Now, it would be great if there's lots of children's books that do this and have a really diverse cast of characters. But for one, this is a picture of the Hague Library. And this is the cupboard that's... that has books with characters of color, and it's called Being Different. And it's in with, the families with two mothers or some people in wheelchairs. So they're over here. These are children's books that we can read with people in it. And over here is, okay. So that's problematic. You have to go looking for them. because it's not going to be a book you just pick up, right? Because it's not going to be in the regular book trays. This is not the case in all libraries, but it is the case in quite a few. Being different is a proper category in quite a few libraries still. Now what about those children's books? So when you do find them, it is still kind of tricky. You gotta be a little critical, because there's many with good intentions, but the actual message that comes out of them needs to be looked at. So don't just buy it because it looks all nice and diverse. Also really have a look what the storyline is. We have here, there's quite a range of books that have the message we're all the same. A little bit of a colorblind type idea. One example of that is Babak op vakantie. Babak on holiday. Does everybody know Babak? No, there's his no. Your yeses and nos. The whole premise of Babak is that they have how many kids? 6, 7, 8, who all have a different color and a different skill. It's also really gendered, but that's okay. And the whole point is that they're super different. Now, and they go on holiday, and then they get into arguments, and they all retreat to their own color. Oh, there they are. It's okay. 2, 4. Okay. They all retreat to their own part of the island, and they only want to eat fruits of their own color. So the blue one only eats blue fruits, and the red one only eats red fruits. And then they start building their own little house in their own color. So total polarization. Okay, great. The painting really goes completely off, and then this is what happens. They start fighting with the paint, and it becomes a big thing. And then they end up like this, all like multicolored. Yeah. And then they realize they're all the same. Yeah. And they're all the same. And why are you fighting? Because we're all the same. And then they hug, and it's all good. Now, it might seem like a nice message, but can you really only get along if you're all the same? Is that really the message here? See what I mean? So it seems okay, like, oh, because it's nice to find commonalities. You know, we're all humans. Of course you want to find commonalities and things in common and things that you can share. But if the message is, if we're all going to be different and have different habits and different, ideas, then we got to end up fighting. And only if we all become unrecognizably the same, right, is when we actually get along. So it's okay to read books like this, but be aware of the underlying message that if you don't talk about that critically, and I know for some people it's like talking critically to toddlers about Babak, yeah, you can. You can introduce in a few sentences here and there, isn't that interesting, or isn't it funny how? What do you think, You can actually do that. That's okay. So these books, even though the message I find potentially problematic, can be super educational exactly because you can talk about the different messages that are in here. Then there's the whole we're all different children's books. There's a whole category of those. They tend to be about animals, right? True. We're all different. So there's zebras and there's, leopards and elephants and monkeys. And that's great because they all have their own skills. One can climb up a tree and the other can do all sorts of other things. It's nice. I'm not against these books. But the suggestion that this is read to promote the idea of valuing diversity in humans might make us think that people from different ethnic racial groups are as different as an elephant is from a giraffe. Is not the case. We're all humans, so this is overdoing it. A giraffe and an elephant cannot have babies. Cannot have babies. You can all have babies together. So that... So it's taking it very far. The message might be like they're fundamentally different. And that almost essentializes ethnic racial differences if you start applying this to human beings, right? Because there's essential differences between giraffes and elephants that are not there between different ethnic racial groups in humans. So read the book, it's all fine. Try to not, uncritically apply this to humans. Then something like this is slightly more appropriate maybe to actually look at humans, and that also puts you in the position to talk about the uncomfortable idea of racial differences and all sorts of other differences that you will then have to mention, which is less easy to do than with the animals, but is something that we know works slightly better. Then there's books that really want to have a message about prejudice specifically. I don't know how many people are familiar with Frog and the Stranger. A stranger comes to the frog's little town, and the stranger is a rat. And so the animals talk amongst themselves. Have you seen the rat? Rats stink. This is literally, they stink and they steal and they're unreliable. Okay, so there's lots of prejudice in the beginning about the stranger, the rat. And then, Frog, being the lovely character he is, he's like, no, let me see about rat, maybe sort of nice. But of course, still, they're still talking amongst each other, going like, that rat person, don't let him near, it's not good. Then something happens. The pig's house catches fire, and rat comes along and, puts out the fire with water. He's a hero, and he helps rebuild the house. He's great. Everybody likes rat. All ends well. It's fantastic. So everybody accepts Rat because he was a hero. So to be accepted, you need to be extraordinary. You can't just come in and expect to be treated nicely. You gotta save some people. You gotta put out some fires. This literally happened in France. I don't know if some people remember this, right? With immigrant who saved a toddler from a balcony and got immediate papers to stay in the country. So I don't know what this message is. So somebody's new and you talk about them like this, and then they have to do something heroic, and then it's like, oh, we like you after all. So you can read the book, but it may deserve some critical thinking here. Well, and then there's going to be some shameless self-promotion, because this is the book I wrote, if you've been wondering about these. It's in Dutch, so it's not for all of you in the audience maybe, but it's called Opgroeien in Kleur, and it is indeed a book for parents who are wondering on how to tackle this, because many of us have not been taught how to talk about this. So some of the facts, some of the science behind it, but also just some narrative discussions of the things you can think about when picking out books, when looking at your kids' school materials, right? And how you can guide them through that sort of thing, because there's lots of stereotypes and issues in those as well. So how do you talk about this? There's also a chapter called Help, My Teenager is Woke. So it's also very handy to talk about, because it's I'm all for woke, but sometimes, there may be something to say about it. What I mostly want to advise parents, or basically any adult who's interested in making that difference for the next generation, who in some way deal with kids, professionally or personally, don't let it be something that you just blunder through, because that's what we often do, and parents in particular, they start parenting by accident about this. Because they don't think about it, and because they don't talk about it, all the messages that they do give are accidental. And then you end up giving messages to your children that you did not intend to give, because you didn't think about it, because you didn't talk about it. And parents often, if there's two parents, they will talk to each other, vegetarian or not, how do we feel about screen time, how do we feel about all sorts of things. Never the conversation is how are we raising our children when it comes to ethnic racial issues in society. Is not talked about. And that is the first thing that if you want to be there for the next generation, do think about it, do talk about it, and take a position. Because not doing anything and just saying, I'm kind of neutral about it. People find it difficult to call themselves anti-racist, although everybody's against racism. Interestingly, no, not everybody is. Most people claim to be against racism. But when I say anti-racist, it's like, well, anti. Anti means against, right, people? It just does. So taking that stance and not staying in some sort of neutral zone is what I think is a responsibility when it comes to this type of issue. This has me branded as an activist scientist who is not to be trusted. That's okay, I can live with that. And then I'd like to end with the quote that is dear to my heart, and that is, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor, because that's exactly what happens. You reproduce the status quo, and the status quo is at the moment one of an unequal society for different ethnic racial groups. So neutrality is not an option. Thank you for your attention.
Is it